It is April 28th, 2025, and the Trump administration is saying that this is going to be a very critical week for talks for a possible deal between Russia and Ukraine. But as we've been covering for the last few weeks, everything that we look at from what the Trump administration is presenting, it doesn't seem as though they're really offering up anything that is going to get Russia to agree to some sort of a deal. You did have Russian President Putin announce a 3-day ceasefire to take place surrounding Victory Day coming up in May, as it is the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. But beyond that, we don't seem to be seeing much progress, at least for right now. We are also hearing from Russia for the first time that they had North Korean forces fighting alongside Russian troops in the Kursk region. They made that announcement as they also revealed that they had taken full control of the Kursk region following a Ukrainian incursion into the area last year. Now, I will be the first to say that I was openly skeptical of these reports that there were North Korean forces fighting alongside Russian troops, right? I was raising the fact that you have the language barrier. You also have the question of whether Russia would be willing to allow North Korean forces to die, to fight alongside them, and to die in a war against not just Ukraine, but the entire West. And you also had the fact that Russia hasn't acknowledged it until now, but we also did still have that military agreement between Russia and North Korea in place this entire time. So now we're starting to learn more about what was actually happening on the ground. And when it comes to what this means for the overall conflict and where things could be headed in terms of talks, I got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Jim Jatras, a geopolitical analyst and former U.S. diplomat. Jim, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, it's always a pleasure. I'm always happy to be on with you.
Yeah, always good to have you on the show and to get your insights on the crazy world that we live in. I want to get into the latest here because I know that Russian President Putin just announced that Russia is willing to engage in a 3-day ceasefire from May 8th to May 11th to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Victory Day and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now, we've already seen Russia agree to a ceasefire, a limited one on the targeting of energy infrastructure. We also saw them offer a temporary ceasefire over the Easter holiday, both of which Russia came back and said, hey, Ukraine has violated this thousands of times. So, what do you make of Putin's offer here? Is this just meant to be a gesture of goodwill? And is there a chance of a ceasefire?
I think one of the good things about where we are at this juncture is that pretty much everybody's cards are on the table. The Russians don't want a ceasefire. They don't want a Minsk III. They've made it very, very clear that they want as a permanent peace settlement, a comprehensive settlement. The Americans have made it clear that all the early optimism that we were going to actually offer something meaningful in terms of a final settlement, that isn't going to happen either. That Trump wants a ceasefire. Whether that's his personal preference or not, what the administration wants is to try to trick the Russians into another Minsk III type agreement. And this is something I pointed out way back in December, that they could not. It's really not possible for the United States to offer a real settlement. So I think what each side is doing is using the other to try to get to its goal. That the Americans are still talking settlement, but they're still hoping to get the Russians to, get their stupid pills and agree to a temporary truce. And I think the Russians are, to some extent, trying to string the Americans along, say, oh, we'll talk ceasefire. Oh, look, well, here's a holiday ceasefire. We'll have and again, I'm sure there's goodwill behind it on some level for not only Victory Day, but like the Easter Pascha ceasefire that we had, last week. But I think what they're really trying to do is keep the Americans on the hook, keep the Americans talking, ceasefire, knowing that they won't really agree to a ceasefire unless it points to a final settlement, which unfortunately is very unlikely to occur. I don't see any way that Washington can offer anything realistic to the Russians. The sad thing is, I think the Russians are still waiting for Godot. I think they're still waiting, fighting a pedagogical war, the slow grind, in the hopes that eventually the other side will come to the table and offer something real. And I don't think they want to face the fact that isn't going to happen. They're just going to have to win the damn war. And they don't really want to do that because, well, for a number of reasons, but I think they consider that a less stable outcome than a negotiated outcome, which I think is a wrong calculation on their part.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring that up because when I've been looking at this, at least the reports on the proposal that the US is, presenting to Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
presenting to their
Yeah.
European allies, I'm looking at this and I'm going, they're not taking this seriously, right? They'll throw in Crimea, recognition of Crimea. That's nothing to Russia in the grand scheme of things in terms of what would really force them to the table and force them to make a deal. And yet, when you look at the way that Trump is handling this, we saw Trump attended the funeral of Pope Francis over the weekend. And it was during that visit that he had this one on one meeting with Zelensky. Now, Macron seems to try to get in on that meeting, but there were only two chairs there. So I guess he wasn't invited. But when it comes to Trump's public statements following that meeting, he said that he wants Putin to, quote, stop shooting, sit down, and sign a deal. Yet, when you're looking at what's really going on here, the fact that Russia is the side actively winning this war, and then you're looking at Trump's statements, what do you make of his rhetoric here?
Um, yeah, the United States is willing to recognize that the Crimea is now Russian. I hear that we're also going to recognize that the sky is blue. I mean, this absurd. I mean, again, remember early on, everybody was talking about, oh, Kellogg is being marginalized. He's being pushed off to the side. He's just going to go chat up the Ukrainians while the real diplomacy is going to be conducted with Witkoff. And then when they finally come out with a deal, it's basically the Kellogg plan, the thing that he floated with Fred Fleitz back in last year sometime. So it really is a lousy deal that the Russians have no way in the world the Russians are going to accept this. Now, maybe Trump put that out there with the idea that not only will the Russians not accept it, but the Ukrainians cannot accept it. All this talk about we'll walk away from the table. Remember, underlying the whole Trump approach is this ridiculous pretense that we're the neutral broker between two warring parties, and we don't have a dog in that fight. You two boys are fighting. We'll knock some heads together, and you guys will come to an agreement. Why won't you be reasonable? Even though Marco Rubio admitted it's a proxy war between the United States and Russia, and Ukraine is simply just a cat's paw that we're using. So, I guess I keep coming back to what Trump really wants and increasingly desperately wants is some kind of a ceasefire because he's been foolish enough to allow himself to be sucked in and making it his war and not just Biden's war. Now, some people are saying his talk with Zelensky means, okay, they had a come to Jesus talk, and Trump told him what for. If you don't accept this agreement, we're out of here. That means the stop of U.S. support for Ukraine. I don't see that. They may take a step back from all this pretense of diplomacy, but I don't see them stopping the support for Ukraine either directly or using the Europeans as our conduit, because I think especially Hegseth has made it very clear that the real goal here is to unload the Ukraine problem on the Europeans, let them be the ones to support Kiev while we, seemingly walk away and go have better wars to fight in the Middle East or in the Western Pacific against the Chinese. So, on that front, by the way, I think a lot of this fuss and fury between the Europeans and the Americans, I think it's mostly for show. I don't think there's as much distance between them as we pretend there is.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point to keep in mind because they are putting on a great show, right? You've got Trump, he seems to be frustrated with everybody. He's frustrated with Putin, Zelensky, at least at brief moments. And then you look at what they're actually doing. And yeah, I think it's really important to pay attention to those members of Trump's cabinet, like Hegseth, like Rubio. Okay, what are they actually doing?
Exactly.
Because as we saw with Steve Witkoff, and exactly as you pointed out there, he meets with Putin multiple times. He comes back and he's talking about the five regions, right? These five regions that have all voted to join the Russian Federation since 2014. And then all of a sudden, the conversation changes, and now it's just about recognition of Crimea. And I'm looking at this and going, okay, wait a second. You have Witkoff basically saying this is kind of what Putin said that he would agree to, but to claim that, oh, we just have to get everyone on board with recognizing Crimea, that does not address any of the issues that Russia has been talking about for months now. What do you make of the fact that the conversation has become so Crimea centric, as if the US just has to convince Zelensky and then Russia's going to get on board and we're going to magically end this war with a deal?
It really does come down to whether the people in the Trump administration are that naive to think that the Russians would agree if you just throw them that one little bone, or for that matter, they can get Kiev agree to this too. I mean, given the kind of people running around Kiev with guns, Zelensky's longevity may not be worth very much if he were to agree to something like that. I don't know if they really think that if they can solve that one, cut that one Gordian knot, whether this thing can actually fly. I don't think they're that naive. Again, unless the Russians have taken their stupid pills, they're not going to agree to that. So, and now maybe this is just an excuse to walk away from the active role in the negotiation and the diplomacy. Perhaps it is. Maybe it's just a ploy to do that, or maybe they just don't know what else to do. Maybe they're simply victims of their own lack of options. So they're just throwing it out there on the wall to see if anything sticks, and or running up to pick my metaphor, run up the flagpole and see who salutes. But in any case, I don't think they really know what to do at this point.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch, and you kind of see that frustration playing out, right? You have Trump over here threatening Russia. You have Steve Witkoff saying, let's make a deal with Russia. This is what they want. Then you have Marco Rubio, and we've seen this rhetoric from Marco Rubio for a few weeks now, where he starts out with, hey, we're going to see very soon if Russia is serious about a deal. Now he's saying that this coming week, this week now, is going to be very critical when it comes to making a deal. And Rubio seems to be of the mindset of Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, which is we need to put the pressure on Russia. We need to force them to the negotiating table. We need to threaten them with more sanctions, as if, I don't know, whatever number of sanction we're at, that
What's
is
left?
going to really do the job.
Yeah.
Exactly. How do you see Rubio and kind of his role here? Because he is in Trump's ear. And I think my concern is always, to a certain extent, that he's going to try to convince Trump, oh, we need to go the Biden route and really put the pressure on Russia. And at some point, Trump is going to get frustrated and he's going to listen.
And that may be, look, I think it's pretty clear there are different factions within the administration. You've got, the Waltz, the Rubio, the Hegseth, on the one side, Kellogg, obviously. And then on the other side, you have Witkoff, who at least seems to be willing to have a conversation with the other side and actually hear what they say on occasion, which is very unusual for anybody in Washington, even though he obviously doesn't know much about the topic, can't even remember the names of the four oblasts. Trump, in his characteristic style, seems to just want to have the win. He wants the win. He doesn't care what the win is. He just wants the win. So he's listening to these idiots arguing with each other and trying to find some way to thread the needle. At this point, he's coming down more actually on the Kellogg side than on the Witkoff side. But again, I think his room for maneuver is pretty small. He just wants somebody to agree to something so he can check that box, say, I won, I'm out of here. We put this thing successfully on hold. We can go do other things. Now, if that fails, which it almost certainly will, then the next thing is to blame somebody. And it's either going to blame the Ukrainians or blame the Russians. Maybe you can try to blame both. I don't know. But I think that's what we're approaching now. And I think that's where this, in a few days, we'll see. Because unless the Russians do agree to something like a very substantial long-term truce, which basically turns into a substitute for the real peace agreement that they say they've been wanting, unless that happens, I think this whole thing falls apart and somebody's going to get blamed and Trump's going to throw rocks at somebody. At this point, I would tend to guess it's going to be more the Russians that he'll hold responsible rather than Zelensky.
Yeah, and I think as you noted earlier, we haven't seen any evidence that Trump is actually going to pull US support for Ukraine. We saw,
Mm-hmm.
a week there where he was
Yeah.
trying to put pressure on Zelensky and then he got what he wanted. He said, yeah, you can have the military aid back, the intelligence sharing, and on and on. But when we see this rhetoric about, oh, we're just going to walk away if we don't get a deal, I'm going, I do not see that Trump is going to stop support for Ukraine or stop support for the Europeans in their support for Ukraine. And I'm with you. I think that he wants to look to other conflicts. He's got his eye on China, he's got his eye on Iran. What are your concerns for? Right now, the last few weeks, we've had the talk surrounding the war in Ukraine. That has been kind of a main focus. What are your concerns for when the Trump administration starts to shift away from it? Or is that actually a good thing if they're focusing on other things and then Russia can just continue on and do what it wants to do when it comes to the war?
I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, it's hard to see anything good coming out of American policy. I tend to agree with Brian Berletic, who you had on your show, that the fundamental orientation of the United States has not changed. We're still committed to global hegemony, and that we basically need to take down the Eurasian powers, Russia, China, Iran. And so far, taking out Russia first hasn't worked. We've got to shift gears, put that on hold, go after somebody else, go after the Iranians, go after the Chinese. Now, there's two forms, and I think first up on deck are the Iranians, especially with Mr. Netanyahu really being in the catbird position to determine whether or not we go to war. Now, there have been some fuzzy comments coming out of Washington that, well, maybe after all, the Iranians could have some kind of a nuclear peaceful civilian program, which of course is their right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And maybe we won't have to deal with the missiles. On the other hand, I don't think Netanyahu will accept that. And I think that also relates to what we're talking about with Ukraine, that aside from whether there can be a deal on Ukraine, I think the Trump administration would like at least open a dialogue with Russia, get the embassies staffed up again, to return to some sort of normal diplomatic discourse with the Russians, because they would like the Russians to help twist the Iranians' arms to agree to an agreement which fundamentally would look kind of like the one that Gaddafi agreed to before we killed him. And I think the Iranians are not stupid enough to realize that if they do come up with an agreement, that A, the United States will not abide by it, and B, the agreement would have to be such that they're fundamentally disarmed and set up for a regime change operation. They have to understand that that's what we're trying to do. We couldn't take the Russian chess piece off the table. Now let's see if we can take the Iranian chess piece off the table, then go after the Chinese, and then maybe come back to the Russians after that.
Yeah, knowing that every piece that they do target, that hurts the other pieces to a certain extent, right? In the same way that Iran and Russia and China can all work together, they can also be harmed by one of their other allies being harmed in the process. Now, taking it back to Russia a little bit, because I know this is something that we've also been following too, is the kind of propaganda war of it all, right? The information war that we are currently living in. And it's been interesting to see in recent months. You obviously had the Ukrainians launch this incursion into Russia's Kursk region. You had Russia respond to it. And then you had Ukraine come out and say, hey, there's North Korean troops in Kursk. Now, Russia's response was not to confirm that. They did notably have a military agreement that they signed with North Korea. And so I know when I've been following it, I was sitting here going, well, I'm not seeing evidence of this. But yes, they do have that military agreement. Yes, that is possible. It's also possible that Ukraine and the West could be blowing this up because North Korea is another one of their favorite targets. Now we have Russia coming out and saying, hey guys, guess what? We liberated the Kursk region fully. Oh, and also we worked with North Korea in the process in order to do so. What do you make of this current situation, how Russia has handled the information that has been out there and what we know now?
Well, let's remember when the whole issue of the North Koreans came up, the big story in the West was Russia is so desperate for manpower. They're so lacking, they can't recruit. All their troops are dying. They need more men. And they're turning to the North Koreans to replenish their ranks. And that was the propaganda line. Now, obviously, that was false. But I think a lot of people who are a little more realistic or even more sympathetic to the Russian side ran with it in the other direction. That's all a lie. There are no North Koreans fighting with the Russians. And I at the time, I remember wondering, why are they going out to say that? Because A, they don't know. But B is, hey, if I were Kim Jong-un, and my army hadn't fought a war in 80 years, and this is state-of-the-art, cutting-edge military developments going on in Ukraine with your ally, Russia, why not send some of your boys over there to get some combat experience, embed some of them with the Russian forces so they can actually get that kind of experience and that kind of a firsthand awareness of military developments. Now, I don't know how many of them are. I don't suspect they're probably making a big chunk of the Russian manpower that's there, but I would be very surprised from the beginning if there had not been some North Koreans there for the reasons that I described. So I did sort of wonder why so many people were so quick to poo-poo and say, oh, no, there are no North Koreans there, when it would make perfect sense to have some North Koreans there, not because the Russians are desperate for manpower, but because it would be good military policy from both sides. So I'm not surprised at this at all.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see. And I know when I was looking at it initially, I was going, okay, you obviously have the language barrier that exists there. You have the question of exactly as you were saying, how Russia would be using these troops if they were involved. And the interesting thing about the way that the West has also covered it is almost with a shock, right? How dare Russia have North Korean troops in Russia's Kursk region when Ukrainian troops are the ones now crossing the line coming into Russia and now being killed by, as they said, North Korean troops. And it's like, well, wait a second. First of all, no one is forcing, or maybe NATO is forcing them, but no one is forcing Ukraine to go in across Russia's border, right, to launch this incursion. But at the same time, we also know that there are a number of foreign mercenaries on the ground in Ukraine. We know just how involved the US and its Western allies have been in every attack that has been launched by the Ukrainians and with the intelligence sharing. So, what do you make of almost kind of that double standard that comes up on the Western side when they're looking at this and they're like, how dare Russia have any North Koreans, but also don't worry about all of the foreigners that are going to Ukraine and playing a very strategic role in this ongoing war against Russia?
Well, when you have a Manichaean worldview that says our side is 100% good, side of the angels, let me polish my halo here, and the other side are just 100% evil, they have no legitimate interests, then anything and everything, any possible criterion can be weaponized in terms of saying how good we are, how noble we are, and how evil the other side is. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense that they would have some representation from their allies there on the Russian side. North Koreans, frankly, hey, if I were the Russians, I would get some Iranians, some Chinese, and maybe some, whoever else their friends are. Again, for combat experience, to promote interoperability. You mentioned the language factor. Of course, in NATO, the operating language is English, and that makes perfect sense. So what else are they all going to speak to each other? And you would think that in these alliances, or in some cases quasi alliances, they would be concerned about interoperability, and they would have people that would get Russian language training as the only obvious language in common that they could use for joint operations. So I'm not surprised at all. And then, of course, remember just a couple of weeks ago, the Russian strike on Sumy, which was billed as an attack on, holiday people on Palm Sunday, when in fact it was a military ceremony for awards for the Kursk operation, which evidently included a number of foreign representatives. We don't know how many and from which countries, but obviously from the Russian point of view, and I think objectively, that was a legitimate military target, and they apparently killed a lot of those foreigners in addition to the number of Russians. By the way, as an American, I do wonder how many Americans have died in this damn thing so far. I mean, how many have been killed either as these volunteers or mercenaries or whatever you want to call them, but also how many, active duty personnel who are embedded with the Ukrainian forces. As we know, for example, HIMARS and all these other weapon systems, the Ukrainians can't operate those systems on their own. Those have to be American personnel, either military or contractors. And the last thing is a Ukrainian pushes the button, so it's a Ukrainian strike and not an American strike. I don't know how many of those people we've lost needlessly, and I think unjustifiably participating in this war.
Yeah, and it is yet another reminder, especially, and if I were Russia, I would be watching what some of these European leaders are saying
Mhm.
right now when they're talking about, hey, we're getting all of these troops ready, or maybe it's just talk at the moment, to as soon as there's a ceasefire, as soon as there's some sort of agreement to flood Ukraine and to be ready for essentially the next war. Now, granted, they're phrasing it as these are just peacekeepers, right? These are just people here to make sure that the ceasefire is kept intact. But that has got to be the biggest red flag to Russia, the country that has said no NATO membership for Ukraine, yet Europe is getting ready to treat them even more like a NATO member. And going back finally, we've had this talk about the fact that Russia seems to a certain extent want a deal, right? They want to have normalization with the West. They want to have some kind of dialogue with them. They do not want World War III. They've made that very clear. What are your concerns moving forward for how Russia handles this? Even as right now it's kind of stringing things along, saying, hey, we'll give you a victory day ceasefire, we'll give you this and that, we'll have talks, not agreeing to a deal right now. But what are those concerns for as we get further down the line if we do see the US start to offer up the provisions that Russia has been asking for years now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how much further down the line of offering things to the Russians the United States can do. I mean, even offering Crimea, has provoked a firestorm in Kiev and in the European capitals. Can they go beyond that? Really, I don't know. I am concerned about this Victory Day truce. I mean, the Pascha Easter truce for 30 hours was of short enough duration, as you point out, very badly observed by the Ukrainian side. It wasn't really a big worry. 3 days for Victory Day. I mean, how long does a truce have to be before the other side takes that as a convenient opportunity to say, oh, there's a truce, let's put some troops in there? And that's, I think, a danger, that if the Russians agree to any kind of a truce for too long of a time period, there starts to be pressure building to extend that truce, and it becomes then a pretext to put in these foreign forces. And then it comes down to the other question is, what is their military strategy? Again, so far it's, the slow grind, attrition, killing vast numbers of Ukrainians, which in my opinion, by the way, is unconscionable, the way they've been pursuing this. But the idea is at some point the Ukrainian forces will crack. Well, when they do crack, what are their military goals? If the Ukrainian forces disappeared entirely, what do the Russians have in mind in terms of a military outcome to this war? If there is no agreement, which I don't think there will be, have they made up their mind? Maybe they have several different contingency plans as to how to do that. But again, their military approach seems to be more pedagogical, trying to force an agreement on the other side rather than say, let's just destroy the enemy's ability to make war, destroy their logistics, to destroy their command and control, force them to stop, and then we take whatever parts of Ukraine we think are appropriate, or embed in Kiev or whatever's left of a rump Ukraine, whatever regime they want to see there. I don't know how they get their denazification goal without physical control of virtually all of Ukraine. This is something Mark Sloboda has raised, and I think is entirely right in asking that question. I don't see it yet that the Russian leadership has thought that answer through. Maybe they have. I hope they have, but maybe they haven't. Maybe they're still hoping somebody will offer them a real deal. So I don't know, that there's still a lot of variables here.
Yeah, there are, and it gives us plenty to talk about and to continue to cover. And I'm always glad when I get to have you on and to kind of get your take on the latest. I know that there are a lot of moving parts here and a lot at stake all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Jim Jatras, geopolitical analyst and former U.S. diplomat, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.